On the polished maple of a 40-foot table, a miniature ocean was being fought over with wooden blocks and dice. Admirals leaned forward as if the tiny model ships could feel the weight of their decisions. A junior officer, assigned to play the Americans, pushed a small painted carrier into open water and announced a move that, in the world of the game, should have changed everything. The umpire reached for a pair of dice. They clattered across the table and landed on a number everyone could read: 9. The damage charts were explicit. A roll like that, against the odds the Japanese planners had not wished to face, translated into 2 carriers sunk. Akagi, Kaga, names that stretched the pride of a navy, were suddenly gone from the board. For a breath, the mess hall of the battleship Yamato fell silent in a way not even the ship's boilers could drown out. Then the hand of Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki closed over the dice, and the rehearsal unspooled differently. They did not call it cheating. In the language of admirals and aides, it became intervention, clarification, rerun. The dice were re-rolled. The number changed. Kaga returned to the fleet. The scenario resumed on terms the planners preferred. The wargame had been intended as a crucible, to test Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's master plan with the sort of realism the Pacific would demand. Instead, it became a theater of affirmation, a ritual to bless a decision already made. If the tale of this story sounds blunt, that bluntness is earned. For months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had tasted victory after victory. From the shock of Pearl Harbor to the conquest of the Philippines and the fall of Singapore, success had become a habit. That habit hardened into a conviction. Japan could control the sea and sky of the Pacific. In strategic terms, that confidence had a name among those who study militaries. Historians call it victory disease. Victory disease did not merely inflate estimates of enemy weakness. It made inconvenient outcomes improbable in the minds of commanders. It encouraged a readiness to smooth away signs of risk rather than confront them. Yamamoto's plan for Midway was audacious and elegant in its map work. The aim was to lure the American carrier forces into a trap, to draw them toward a prepared strike force and eliminate them in a single decisive action. To test that plan, a wargame would be staged aboard the fleet's flagship, using the most literal kind of models: painted blocks for carriers, rubber-tipped aircraft markers, and dice to translate chance into charted damage. For 4 days, the Yamamoto's mess hall became the theater where the future of the Pacific would be sampled, and those present verified. The participants were not jesters. They were the Navy's best: admirals with campaign experience, staff officers with maps, and umpires entrusted with the faith that simulations must be impartial. Rear Admiral Ugaki's place at the table was complicated. He was both Yamamoto's chief of staff and one of the senior umpires, the officer whose job it was to interpret dice and roll with the cold arithmetic of the damage tables. That dual role created a structural tension, an umpire whose loyalties ran to the man whose plan the game was meant to test. Around him stood other figures who would later appear in wartime dispatches and memoirs. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, carrier strike commander, watched with a tightness that matched his reputation for caution. Commander Minoru Genda, a younger officer who had helped conceive carrier tactics, bristled at assumptions he thought unsafe. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, the nominal umpire who actually rolled many of the dice, kept a sober face as wooden blocks were nudged across the painted Pacific. The game had rules, and most of those rules were clear. Dice represented the chaos of battle. Damage tables translated numbers into lost planes, crippled ships, and catastrophic fires. Reconnaissance was limited by chance and range. A carrier found without air cover was vulnerable. Timing mattered in minutes, and minutes were where futures were decided. All of which made the table a blunt instrument for truth, when allowed to speak. But a different logic governed how the organizers wanted the game to speak. If reality was the true umpire, the Yamato's mess hall aspired to be a court of appeals for strategy. When the dice told an inconvenient truth, a senior hand could say, implicitly, that the dice had not accounted for experience, for the daring seamanship of Japanese aviators, for the unspoken certainties of the real fleet. The dice were ambiguous instruments. The people who owned the plan had every incentive to interpret ambiguity as confirmation. To an outsider who values rigorous testing, the 4-day exercise receded from the realm of simulation into the territory of performance. Scenarios that envisioned the Americans arriving early, or the Yorktown making it back to action in days rather than weeks, or the defensive depth that carriers could provide if they were used in concentration, all of those scenarios were treated with the same gestures. They could be discussed, dismissed, rerun. A role showing catastrophic carrier losses could be reinterpreted as improbable. A damaging sequence could be softened into a lesson about execution rather than about strategic flaw. Commander Genda, among others, protested these habits. He argued that a rehearsal divorced from the possibility of failure teaches only the rituals of victory, not their limits. Genda was not simply a pessimist. He had been among those who argued for a more nuanced use of carriers, daring in tactics, disciplined in protection. He understood the operational calculus that made timing and reconnaissance the fulcrum of any carrier engagement. When the junior officer playing the American side pushed an aggressive sortie farther east, aiming to cut off Japanese forces before they consolidated, Genda heard in that move a legitimate and dangerous possibility. Some at the table, however, heard instead the crack of an inconvenient implication, that the plan they preferred required the enemy to do exactly what the enemy was least likely to do. Okumiya's roll of 9 is the moment military storytellers always return to because it is so pure in its implications. It reduced a scenario to a mathematical verdict: 2 carriers destroyed. For a navy that measured prestige and deterrence in metal and flame, that verdict was intolerable. The response was not to accept the loss and test the system's ability to cope. It was to repeat the role. Repetition is a subtle and civilized form of bias. A second role that favors one's expectations can be claimed as new evidence rather than a correction. It lets the game tell the story the planners prefer while preserving the veneer of method. The scene played like a slow corrosion of the social contract around testing. Every rerun, every clarification was a small victory for the narrative that Japan could impose its will on the Pacific. One version of the game produced the result the Admirals wanted. Yamamoto's terms survived the crucible. The other version, the one the dice first gave them, suggested catastrophe. What the table recorded mattered less than what the men at the table believed they needed to believe. The consequences of that inversion were not confined to the mess hall. War is a system that converts assumptions into outcomes. If commanders enter battle convinced of certain truths, they will marshal forces, order launches, and set doctrines to fit those truths. If, before battle, those truths have been protected from falsification, then commanders will sail into combat with their blind spots intact. The rigged rehearsal aboard Yamato did not write the Pacific's fate by itself, but it hardened a set of expectations that would soon be tested by instruments beyond anyone's control. Signals intercepted at sea, engines that refused to start, pilots who made choices under fire. The drama at the table had a human edge. The junior officer who played the Americans was not some faceless prop. He was young, observant, and surprisingly creative in his contrarian moves. He sent carriers out of textbook range, he simulated bold, desperate strikes, he treated his wooden blocks as if they were ships with captains, not mere tokens in a validating ritual. The more he nudged the game toward realistic danger, the more the room closed ranks. That's not to say the room was uniformly dishonest. Several officers wanted realism. Ugaki, as chief umpire and Yamamoto's staff officer, believed in the plan and the need to shield it. His interventions were not framed as subterfuge in internal memos. They were meant, in his mind, to preserve the fleet's morale and focus. Still, the structural conflict of his role, deciding the game and also managing the campaign, would later be read by many historians as a critical error. There were other awkward moments. An exercise scenario in which American carrier aviation operated with an aggressive, off-schedule tempo was brushed aside as unlikely. When the dice suggested heavy losses from a surprise American strike, the room debated whether the damage table properly reflected Japanese pilot skill or whether the Americans had somehow gained an impossible edge. All of these debates were, in their way, rationalizations. They were also symptoms of an institution in which dissenting data were smoothed out until they no longer threatened the overall narrative. The Japanese had more than pride at stake. The idea of a decisive battle, a single clash that would settle the Pacific, is powerful and ancient in naval thought. Yamamoto's plan sought such a moment, a knockout blow that would remove the American carrier threat and leave Japan free to consolidate gains. To him, the game was supposed to test whether that strategy could survive scrutiny. Instead, in a paradox historians rarely see without a shiver, the game became a mechanism to make the plan survive. Away from the table, other currents were moving fast. The United States Navy was not idle. In a windowless room in Honolulu, a small and scrappy team of cryptanalysts at Station Hypo were painstakingly reading fragments of Japanese cipher traffic. Joseph Rochefort, the civilian-turned-intelligence officer who led the unit, had developed a knack for reading between lines, and for using deception as a mirror. If the Pacific's next move could be divined from coded phrases, then deception might be used to prompt such a phrase. The Hypo team, working with island-based spotters and with a flair for improvisation, would soon attempt an operation that looked like a simple message: a fake problem in the water supply at Midway. It was a small trick designed to flush out the truth. If the Japanese responded to the bait, the Americans would know what the Japanese intended to attack. That maneuver, an apparently trivial request for fresh water, was the kind of low-tech intelligence gambit that can alter strategic estimates. It was also a gamble that rested on a different institutional ethos: the willingness to test assumptions, to seek disconfirming evidence rather than to silence it. Hypo's leaders had no interest in preserving comforting narratives. They wanted facts, even if the facts were messy. Meanwhile, other events were reshaping the material circumstances of the upcoming battle. In late May, the Battle of the Coral Sea had produced confusing results for both sides. For the Japanese, reports suggested that the Americans had suffered carrier losses that, if true, would validate Yamamoto's calculus. Fewer American carriers in the theater meant the Japanese could press the attack. But the fog of war and poor Japanese assessment of damaged American ships led to misreadings. The American carrier USS Lexington was lost, but the Yorktown, though damaged, would be repaired in days. That possibility, the quick return of Yorktown to combat, was the kind of undreamed-of contingency the Yamato table either ignored or downgraded. It is worth pausing on Yorktown's repairs because they illustrate how small margins can become strategic turning points. The carrier had been struck and was thought out of the running by some Japanese intelligence officers. In reality, American damage control teams, naval engineers, and a gamble by Admiral Chester Nimitz combined to get Yorktown back into action sooner than expected. Naval yards, floating workshops, and a willingness to accept risk in returning a battle-damaged ship to sea turned what Japanese planners expected would be a two-carrier problem into a three-carrier problem. The Yamato table had not fully accounted for that risk, nor had the wargame's custodians considered the American capacity to improvise. The rigidity of their rehearsal made real-world flexibility invisible. Back on the table, as the 4 days of wargaming gave way to a final afternoon of tidy conclusions, the men in the mess hall accepted a sanitized outcome. Yamamoto's plan had been tested and found to be sound, at least by the standards the planners applied. They left the room with renewals of confidence. They prepared the orders and schedules that would carry fleets across thousands of miles of blue. Yet a dissonance remained. The dice whispered a different story, one that had been put aside. The junior officer who had pushed the Americans into a daring sortie felt the chill of being unheard. Genda, who had argued for attention to reconnaissance, held his objections in reserve. Ugaki, who had twice stepped in to rerun inconvenient roles, carried the complex mixture of conviction and defensiveness that comes when a man believes the stakes justify the means. That mixture, confidence buffered by small acts of reinterpretation, was not merely a failing of personalities. It was a systemic vulnerability. Tests that cannot fail do not reveal truth. They reveal the contours of imagination. When institutions subordinate reality to preferred narratives, they trade agility for reassurance. The Yamato's 4-day war game was not a single bright crime. It was a series of ordinary decisions that, taken together, made the fleet less prepared for a surprise that would arrive not purely by chance, but by the interplay of intelligence, repair, and timing. The dice had spoken, the men in the mess hall had chosen to listen selectively. Outside the naval hierarchy, other processes were quietly forcing reckonings. In the Pacific's shadowed rooms, codebreakers waited for confirmations. On repair docks, welders and blackout curtains worked toward miraculous returns. Pilots trained with an intensity that cared nothing for the politics of staff rooms. Each of these actors would soon be drawn into a collision where the difference between a rerun and a roll of the real dice could not be corrected by another retelling. And yet, the most dangerous part of the story is not the single act of intervention on that table. The dangerous part is the culture that allowed the intervention to feel sensible. It is the habit of privileging stories that make victory seem inevitable. It is the inclination to punish or ignore dissent because dissent is inconvenient. It is the comfort of a rehearsal that confirms a plan rather than stresses it until weak seams show. In a world organized for decisiveness, rehearsals must be venues of honesty. They must place the possibility of failure at the center so that organizations can adapt. The Yamato mess hall did the reverse. It placed certainty at the center and made failure an exception to be excised. When the Admirals left the table, they went back to a Pacific that had begun to tell its own stories. Signals moved in the night. Wounded ships were patched with a speed that made planners do mental arithmetic again. A tiny trick in Honolulu, a message about fresh water, would soon ask the Japanese to show their hand. Yet on the Yamato, the confidence of a rehearsed victory had already hardened into plans. Orders were drafted. Air groups were scheduled. Fuel was allocated. The machinery of a bold plan was in motion. It is in these last quiet hours, when rehearsals have finished but the first ships have not yet sailed, that the gap between simulation and reality matters most. The dice had offered a warning. The men at the table had preferred another story. The Pacific was about to test which story would survive. If there is a single image that captures this moment, it is not an explosion or a funeral. It is the small clatter of dice on a table, the size of a room. Sounds so ordinary it could be ignored. And the larger silence that followed when the dice's verdict was set aside. That silence would not hold for long. In the coming days, the decisions taken in the Yamato's mess hall would play out in the air over Midway Atoll and on the decks of carriers. The amateur theater of a re-rolled die would confront the brutal arithmetic of torpedoes, reconnaissance, and timing. The question that now waited like a held breath was simple and terrible. What happens when a test is built to pass? Would the theater protect the fleet, or would it blind it? Before the answer came, there were still shadows to cross. On one side, the Japanese staff tightened schedules and prepared the fleets, buoyed by a game that confirmed their aims. On the other, a handful of Americans, reading decrypted traffic, began to craft a response designed to exploit assumptions, not reassure them. The stage was set, the players were in place. The smallest things, dice, repair crews, a water test, had started to tip the scales in ways no one aboard Yamato, in that moment of confident planning, fully admitted. If you find this story compelling, please like and subscribe. There is more to unpack about how those tiny decisions rippled into a battle that changed the Pacific. On the other side of the ocean's map, in a cramped, sunlit room in Pearl Harbor, a handful of men with ink-stained fingers were doing something the Yamato's war game refused to do.
They were trying to break their own assumptions. Joseph Rochefort's team at Station Hypo had been reading fragments of Japanese naval traffic for months. They had become fluent in the language of intent that hides behind ciphers. When the language offered a clue, an encrypted reference to AF, Hypo needed to know whether AF pointed to Midway or to somewhere else. It was a small, surgical problem. Force the Japanese to prove, by their behavior, what AF really meant. The trick they chose was low risk, human scale, and oddly theatrical. They arranged for Midway to send a coded message that its water condensers had broken. No one expected poetry from cryptanalysis. The point was simple. If the Japanese intercepted that message and directed their fleet toward the atoll, then the Americans would know that Midway, AF, was the objective. If the Japanese did not respond, the bait had failed, and Hypo would need a new hypothesis. When the enemy answered, they did so in the way Rochefort had hoped. The Japanese transmitted a report that recommended sending supplies to AF. It was the confirmation Hypo sought. AF equals Midway. For the Americans, the deception had worked because their institution incentivized testing assumptions and exposing inconvenient truths. For the Japanese, their decision-making culture had just missed a chance to let a rehearsal show a painful possibility. The deception was only one of several pivots that shifted the balance in the days before the fleets met. At Coral Sea, a month earlier, carrier duels had produced confusion and hard lessons. Japanese battle reports understated American resilience. Their assessments suggested the United States had been crippled in the theater. The Japanese believed they had thinned the American carrier presence. In reality, one carrier had been lost, and another, USS Yorktown, had been damaged but not destroyed. That nuance mattered. It was precisely the kind of contingency the Yamato's mess hall tended to treat as improbable. What proceeded in the repair yards around Pearl Harbor was nothing short of improvisation on a grand scale. Engineers, welders, and damage control teams worked in shifts, patching holes, re-rigging systems, and performing miracles of logistics, sometimes in defiance of prudent caution. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had accepted risk as a necessary component of bold action, ordered Yorktown readied for sea faster than most had expected possible.
The ship would be back in a fight weeks, perhaps days, earlier than Japanese assessments allowed. That extra carrier would change the arithmetic of the expected encounter. Nimitz's decision was not reckless bravado, it was a calculated gamble. He linked industrial capacity, ingenuity, and willingness to accept danger into a decision that trusted facts rather than comforting assumptions. The Japanese rehearsals, by contrast, had been organized to affirm a plan, not to test its edges. The result was a mismatch, not merely numerical, but epistemic, between commanders who sought disconfirming evidence and commanders who avoided it. June dawned with fleets moving into position and orders issued from a confidence hardened by rehearsal. Nagumo's carriers steamed on a thread of timing that assumed U.S. carriers would be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nagumo, who had a reputation for caution, had been given a plan that demanded strict timing and precise coordination. His air wings were briefed to strike Midway itself. Crews were prepared to launch strikes that would crater the atoll's defenses, and then to reassemble and intercept any American carriers that showed themselves. On the morning of June 4, the sequence that the mess hall should have examined in unforgiving detail was about to unfold. The Japanese had launched a large strike against Midway in the early hours, expecting to hit the island and return to recover on fully functional flight decks. Those launches removed a substantial portion of their airborne offensive capability from the carriers temporarily, but they did not remove the risk that an American strike might arrive while decks were cluttered with fuel and ordnance. Reconnaissance failures had been a theme of the Yamato war game and of real operations, but in different ways. The game reduced detection to a role and then allowed the role to be reinterpreted. At sea, the stakes were crude and absolute. A late or misread scout could allow enemy squadrons to find carriers at their most vulnerable. That morning, Japanese scouting launched as planned, but returned with delayed and incomplete reports.
Time, already compressed by a schedule optimized for surprise, began to leak like oil into a fire. When word came that American carriers had been sighted by scout planes, reports that, in the mess hall, could have been treated as a plausible contingency, the problem shifted from what if to what now. Nagumo faced a decision that would cascade through minutes. He could keep the decks in their current configuration, armed for a land strike against Midway, with high-explosive bombs already on ready racks and planes fueled for takeoff. In that case, the carriers would be vulnerable to surface attack. Alternatively, he could order his air crews to rearm with anti-ship ordnance, torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, interface with the deck crews to swap munitions, and then launch a strike at the American carriers. Rearming, however, takes time and requires planes to be on deck, fueled, and momentarily immobile. The choice Nagumo made has been the subject of endless debate. He ordered the rearming. He wanted to strike at the American carriers once they were located. That decision exposed the decks, which were busy places, to the exact hazard the Yamato table should have evaluated in its most severe scenarios. The ship's elevators, hangar crews, and ordnance teams turned in the crowded choreography of refueling and rearming. Aircraft were on deck, threaded with hoses and wired with fuses. This is the material specificity that the dice had tried to symbolize, a number that translates into a scene of smoke and fire in which minute choices determine whether a ship survives. Across the enemy's line, American pilots were already committing themselves to an impossible-seeming course. Torpedo squadrons from the carriers, men in slow, straight-flying machines with wooden propellers and fragile armor, voluntarily headed into the teeth of Japanese combat air patrol. These missions were near suicidal. They required pilots to fly low and slow over the water, while enemy fighters and anti-aircraft gunners had clear, unambiguous fields of fire. Yet these squadrons attacked with discipline and courage. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led one such torpedo squadron with an instinct to engage, despite being separated from the main tactical formation by a navigation error. The torpedo attacks were terrible in their calculus. Most were cut down before they reached their targets. Fighters and flak shredded their formations. Ensign George Gay's story stands like an incision into the broader narrative. The lone survivor of his squadron, he watched from the water as the Japanese fighters circled overhead and as the carrier decks burned. The scale of loss among these squadrons was enormous, and their sacrifice, for a while, seemed to produce nothing but smoke and a long list of names. But in war, sacrifice often rewrites opportunity through distraction. The torpedo squadron's assault served a function no rehearsed table had privileged. It drew Japanese fighters down to sea level to intercept what they perceived as the immediate threat. The dogfights and low-level traumas held the fighter cover, Zeke pilots who might otherwise have been aloft to counter incoming dive bombers. That redistribution of defensive effort opened a narrow, violent window in which dive bombers from the American carriers could arrive almost unopposed. The timing of that arrival is the core drama of Midway. Dive bombers, heavier and faster on their pullouts, came from altitude with gravity as an ally. They were able to strike the Japanese carriers' flight decks at a moment when those decks were literally filled with fuel and bombs being serviced. The results were apocalyptic. In the span of minutes, histories place it as roughly 5 minutes, 3 of the Japanese fleet carriers took mortal blows. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were struck and consumed by raging fires that spread with terrifying speed across fuel-soaked decks. Men on those ships later described decks like infernos, with burning gasoline feeding tongues of fire into hangars and hangars erupting like ovens. The choreography of destruction was precise in its horror. An incoming dive bomber had a few seconds to align, to dive at steep angles, to aim at a relatively narrow target on a heaving deck. When they hit, the combination of ordnance and aviation fuel produced explosions that could not be put out with conventional damage control. The carriers, designed to recover planes and project force, were not designed to resist internal conflagration on such a scale. Commanders who had trusted rehearsals that made such an outcome unlikely now had to watch helplessly as the materialization of their worst-case role unfolded in reality. Meanwhile, the Japanese struck back. Hiryu, which had not been hit in the initial sequence, launched counterattacks that found American carriers and struck the damaged Yorktown. For a time, the battle seemed to be swinging in both directions. Sudden calamity had not ended combat's reciprocity. Yorktown was hit and damaged again, her decks a battered landscape of torn metal and burned fabric. She would not sail far before a later strike sealed her fate. The afternoon would produce a ledger of loss on both sides, but the strategic costs fell far more heavily on the Japanese. By day's end, the accounts tallied a terrible sum. The fleet that had left Japan with carriers formidable in number and brandished as the axis of naval might had lost the pride of 4 carriers, reported as lost on or around June 4 in many contemporary accounts, and thousands of trained pilots and aircrew. Casualty figures vary among reports, but the scale of human toll, sailors and aviators from both sides sent into the sea or into the graves, could be counted in the thousands for Japan and in the hundreds for the United States. The transcription numbers commonly cited, approximately 3,000 Japanese dead and roughly 300 American deaths, capture the asymmetry of human loss that day in blunt terms. These figures are not just arithmetic. They represent the depletion of intangible assets that no factory can instantly replace. Veteran pilots were an experiential reservoir, men whose instincts, muscle memory, and judgment under fire could not be restored by training factories overnight. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built an advantage in pilot quality in the early wartime years. Midway burned away much of that edge. The United States, by contrast, had the industrial depth to replace lost hulls and aircraft at scale. Shipyards could churn out Essex-class carriers, escort carriers, and tens of thousands of aircraft, while pilot training programs could be expanded and accelerated. The result was a narrowing of the temporal advantage Japan had once enjoyed. Strategically, the loss was a pivot. The carriers were not only capital ships, they were the projecting arms of an empire's ambition. Their loss depleted operational reach and the confidence to attempt another knockout blow. For the Japanese fleet, the psychological effect was immediate. The sense of invincibility that had infected the months of rapid conquest was replaced by a sober calculus of attrition. For the Americans, the battle served as a crucible and catalyst. The victories were costly, but they revealed leverage points the United States could exploit. The organizational lessons cut deep. The Yamato's 4-day performance had been, in essence, an exercise designed to preserve a plan. In the mess hall, dice were re-rolled, and inconvenient results were rationalized away. In actual combat, the dice did not care what men preferred. They were represented by aeroplane wings, burned decks, and the human calculus of pilots. When the dice produced a verdict that the table could not accept, the leaders of the rehearsal chose to change the test rather than change the plan. The result was not an immediate catastrophe alone, but a structural mistake. They had insulated a decision from corrective information. Ugaki's interventions have to be understood in this light. As Yamamoto's chief of staff and as an umpire at the table, his role straddled 2 necessary but conflicting duties: to defend a strategy and to ensure that the simulation of that strategy was honest. Intervention has many faces in military life. It can be an act of prudence when it prevents panic. It can be a distortion when it protects an idea from invalidation. Historians debate where Ugaki's acts fall on that spectrum, but the structural problem is not the intentions of one man. It is the institutional design that allows and normalizes intervention when it leads to the protection of preferred narratives. Commander Minoru Genda's arguments about reconnaissance and flexibility, voices that urged a harder look at scouting and at the consequences of rearming on deck, are the voices organizations need. They are the dissenters who ask for a rehearsal to be honest rather than theatrical. In the Yamato's mess hall, those voices were tolerated at times and dismissed at others. The culture of affirmation was stronger. The outcome at Midway demonstrated the cost of that imbalance. The human stories emerging from the aircraft and the carriers deserve sober remembrance. Torpedo squadrons that attacked without fighter protection were mostly destroyed. Their pilots went down with machinery and purpose, their names becoming a litany for survivors and relatives. Dive bomber crews who scored decisive hits paid for those moments with lost comrades and gaping wounds on their own decks. On the Japanese carriers, sailors fought fires until decks collapsed and until orders to abandon ship were given.
The narratives of courage from both navies are the sobering core of the battle's memory. Men doing the only thing they could in the moment, whether that was attacking, defending, or trying to save their shipmates. After Midway, the Japanese Navy faced a multi-layered crisis. Tactically, it had fewer carriers at sea and fewer veteran aviators to staff the ones that remained. Operationally, its doctrine, centered on the hope of a single decisive engagement, was undercut by the reality that attrition and industrial capacity mattered as much as tactical genius. Strategically, the balance of initiative began to shift. The United States, with its continental industrial base and expanding fleet construction programs, could afford a war of replacement that Japan could not match. The Japanese response, in the immediate wake, involved both adaptation and denial. There were efforts to train new pilots more rapidly and to adapt tactics, but those efforts could not instantly replace the tacit knowledge lost with veteran airmen. Furthermore, Japanese records and internal communications reveal a pattern that is all too familiar in organizations: a tendency to audit inconvenient events into acceptable narratives, to ascribe defeat to a string of bad luck or to individual failings rather than to systemic error. This psychological posture made institutional learning slower and more contested. On the American side, the lessons were organizationally different. The victory at Midway did not cause complacency so much as it focused effort. The U.S. Navy doubled down on what had worked: intelligence that sought to validate and invalidate hypotheses, an industrial surge that converted shipyards into strategic weapons, and damage control practices that saved damaged ships and returned them to combat. Nimitz's gamble on Yorktown, for example, was emblematic of a philosophy that recognized the interplay of risk and opportunity. The episode of the fabricated water shortage, a small bit of theater from Station Hypo, now reads like a parable about epistemology. Truth in war does not emerge from how convincing a plan sounds. It emerges from whether a plan can survive disconfirmation. Hypo's method asked for proof. Yamato's mess hall tended to quash it. The difference between those approaches is not merely academic. It is the difference between flexibility and brittle certainty. Less discussed, but equally consequential, were the interpersonal and cultural dynamics that shaped how dissent was treated. Praise for conformity, prestige attached to decisiveness, and the social cost of dissent all contributed to a dangerous equilibrium. Where an organization rewards certainty and punishes questions, rehearsals become performances. They stop being instruments of learning and become instruments of legitimation. Midway demonstrates the cost of that transformation with tragic clarity. There are further subtleties in the post-battle aftermath. Japanese command structures attempted to account for loss through enquiries and reorganizations. The urgent task of replacing losses stimulated doctrinal debate. Should Japan invest in more carriers, in submarines, in planes? The resource constraints of an island nation at war with a continent meant that every decision had trade-offs. The Americans, enjoying a much larger supply base, could afford to commit to a broad program of carrier construction and pilot training, an industrial answer to the tactical problem of attrition. Another consequence is the time lag between tactical success and strategic advantage. The U.S. wins at Midway did not immediately translate into a final victory. They created an inflection point, a new set of probabilities that favored the United States if it sustained effort. That probabilistic shift is the quiet victory of Midway. It changed the odds in ways that would compound over months and years. For commanders and politicians, understanding such inflection points is part of the art of war. For institutions, preserving tests that can show whether they have truly changed course is part of the art of governance. The last part of this story is not a parade of medals or a simple moral. It is an insistence on the mundane mechanics of truth-telling and the hard craft of organizational learning. If rehearsals are to be useful, they must allow for failure to be visible, interpretable, and instructive. They must be designed so that even those in authority, those with reasons to prefer a favorable outcome, cannot easily erase inconvenient data. The simple mechanics of randomization, of independent umpiring, and of institutional incentives that reward dissent are not glamorous, but they are the safeguards that prevent catastrophe. Look back for a moment to the image that began this narrative: a 40-foot table, wooden blocks, and a pair of dice. That image is not an indictment of planning. Plans are necessary, but a demonstration of how tests can be corrupted when their social purpose is replaced by performance. The dice at Yamato did not show malignant intent. They showed the limits of a culture that preferred evaluative theater over brutal, disconfirming truth. When the real dice at Midway rattled out their verdict, reality matched the number the table had first shown. The mess hall that had re-rolled its inconvenient results found itself facing the burned decks, the survivors on life rafts, and the strategic consequences of decisions softened in rehearsal. The irony is sharp. An exercise intended to prove a plan had predicted disaster. The commanders changed the test to avoid that prediction. The actual battle validated the original, unpreferred role. There is a clear institutional lesson for leaders far from naval decks. Designing experiments or rehearsals that are unassailable is easy. Designing ones that can reveal a plan's fatal flaws is the harder task.
Organizations must create structures that invite contradiction and turn it into improvement rather than treating it as discomfort. This means separating functions where possible. Umpires should be impartial, dissenters protected, and tests constructed so that failure is informative rather than embarrassing. It means valuing truth as a resource rather than treating it as a threat to identity. Midway's human cost, tens of thousands of hours of life and labor, the loss of peers and comrades, demands that such lessons be taken seriously. To study the episodes, the dice, the decisions, and the catastrophes is not to gloat over failure. It is to honor lives by learning how to avoid preventable loss in the future. The admirals, the pilots, the engineers, and the cryptographers all made choices under conditions of extreme pressure. Some choices were heroic, some were tragic, and some were shaped by institutional patterns that could have been different. At the end, the Atlantic's blue and the Pacific's immensity are indifferent to human narratives. What matters is what institutions do within them, whether they insist on the truth when it hurts or whether they smooth it away to protect hope. The war games aboard Yamato were meant to be instruments of foresight. Instead, they became instruments of affirmation. The dice on that long table spoke a warning. The men in the room, in a collective act of selective hearing, chose to listen to a more convenient story. The Pacific, indifferent and implacable, enforced the original warning with a harsh pedagogy. Japan rigged their own war games to validate a strategy that felt correct. They reran roles, reinterpreted damage tables, and sidelined dissent. Then, when the oceans test came, reality tracked the first, disfavored role. The carriers burned, men died, and the loss of veteran pilots reshaped the strategic horizon. The dice were right, and the mess hall's rulings were not. If there is a final, sober thought to carry away, it is this: every organization faces moments when a test can fail. Those moments are not merely academic. They are potential turning points with consequences measured in ships, lives, and the balance of history. Designing systems that let failure speak, systems where pilots, deck crews, code breakers, and junior officers can raise alarms without fear of being dismissed, is a moral as well as pragmatic necessity. The cost of not doing so is not abstract. It is measured in fire and smoke on distant decks and in the names of those who did not return. Thank you for staying with this account. If this story about Midway and institutional blindness resonated with you, please subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and which details surprised you most. There are more episodes in this series that examine how organizations succeed or fail at the moments that matter.